There are giant companies, enormous funds, banks that dominate headlines, but none of that comes close to what you're about to discover. Because, while everyone talks about trillions circulating on Wall Street, there's a discrete entity more powerful than any American corporation that quietly moves the wheels of money. $7.9 trillion, and almost no one knows it exists. And this is not a conspiracy theory. It's not fiction. It's a real mechanism, created within the US government itself, that operates as a secret government fund with the autonomy to intervene in currencies, bail out banks, manipulate markets, and influence the economic destiny of entire countries. A structure so strategic that experts call it the most powerful organization you've never heard of. The most unsettling thing, this force doesn't make the headlines. He doesn't give interviews. He is not accountable to the public. And yet, it has more influence over the world economy than many of the institutions you've learned to fear. This is where our story begins. Financial history documentary revealing what's behind the hidden financial power that molds its dollar dominance, prevents silent collapses, and defines how the US controls the world economy, a mechanism so well hidden that, even today, most people have no idea that their decisions depend on it. And the question that remains is simple and disturbing: if there's a fund capable of moving trillions without asking permission, what else could it be doing? Subscribe to the channel and like this video to receive notifications of future new videos. People often think they know the biggest financial powers on the planet. Everyone has heard of big banks, tech corporations, giant funds like BlackRock, Vanguard, J.P. Morgan. But there's something even bigger, quieter, and much more influential. Something that seems to have come from a financial history documentary, but it's operating right now. This is where our story begins, with an entity so colossal that, if it were a company, it would be called the $7.9 trillion company you've never heard of. And yet, most people go their entire lives without knowing it exists. This hidden power is called Exchange Stabilization Fund, a fund that operates within the US Treasury not as a bureaucratic tool, but as a real shadow banking system. He controls billions, influences the value of currencies, intervenes in crises, and, in an almost poetic way, shapes entire parts of the world. Money history without ever appearing in the spotlight. It's as if it were a sleeping giant that, when it moves a finger, makes central banks around the world feel the tremor. What's most impressive is that it wasn't born as a malevolent or mysterious tool. In fact, it emerged as a simple mechanism to stabilize the American currency during a crisis. But, as happens so often in empire finance history, instruments created for protection end up becoming weapons of influence. And so, the Exchange Stabilization Fund became the heart of many secret government funds, a laboratory for discrete operations that never come to the attention of the average citizen. To understand the impact of this, imagine a body capable of interfering with the value of the dollar, the currency that dictates the pace of the global economy. Imagine a fund with the autonomy to act, without depending on Congress, without public debate, without headlines. A fund that can save banks, bring down speculators, and alter the course of financial collapses without the public even noticing. That's why so many experts call this structure hidden financial power. And the more we observe its role, the more we realize that it is present in almost every aspect of the world. Financial scandals of the last 90 years, even when nobody mentions his name. But this story doesn't begin with power. It begins with chaos, with a turbulent time, full of uncertainty, when the world desperately sought a new axis of stability. And, as in any narrative of great impact, money history, to understand how a simple tool transformed into the invisible force that influences us today, we need to go back in time. How the US controls the world economy. This is where we enter a little explored phase of American history, the birth of the Exchange Stabilization Fund. To understand how the Exchange Stabilization Fund transformed into this silent machine of global influence, it's necessary to go back to one of the most critical moments in money history: the collapse of the gold standard in the 1930s. The world was broken. Banks were closing, countries were desperately devaluing their currencies, and nobody, absolutely nobody, knew what the next step would be. It was in this chaotic scenario that the US realized an uncomfortable truth: without its own mechanism to control its currency, it would be just another country adrift. And so the ESF was born, an improvised response that ended up shaping the empire finance history. The curious thing is that the Exchange Stabilization Fund didn't emerge as a large financial project. It began almost as an emergency measure, created with the remaining money from an unexpected revaluation of gold. It was a quick, almost political move that went unnoticed by most of the population. But this small fund carried a crucial detail: he did not need congressional approval to operate. An instrument of this kind, in the hands of the Treasury Department, was the perfect seed for the future. Secret government funds, and that's when a simple stability mechanism transformed into something much more powerful. As soon as it began operating, the ESF gained a strategic role to protect the dollar. It sounds technical, it sounds bureaucratic, but that's exactly the kind of phrase that hides its true power. Protecting the dollar meant deciding when to intervene in the exchange rate, when to buy currencies from other countries, when to bail out banks, when to prevent speculative attacks. Each of these decisions was deeply connected to what we now call global financial system explained, and, like any tool created in turbulence, the ESF quickly discovered that it could go beyond what was written on paper. From this point on, the story ceases to be merely institutional and begins to take on an almost cinematic air. Because, with the ESF in hand, the American Treasury realized something obvious and at the same time frightening: whoever controls the currency, controls the world, and controlling the dollar meant, in a way, directing it. How the US controls the world economy. This was the first time the fund ceased to be merely a stabilizer and began to act as a political force. A force capable of preventing a financial collapse, explained, manipulating international flows and operating behind the scenes while the public only saw the tranquil surface of the system. But the birth of the ESF is only the beginning. Because what it would become later, silent, agile, untouchable, is something that no legislator of that time could have foreseen. And it is precisely when it begins to accumulate power that we enter the most intriguing point of this story. How did such a small fund, created almost by accident, come to have a global impact? With the Exchange Stabilization Fund operating, something unexpected began to happen within the US Treasury. What should have been merely a technical fund began to function as a parallel power. While other institutions depended on debates, votes, and approvals, the ESF acted without bureaucracy, without scrutiny, and almost without limits. This is how a discrete mechanism gained the reputation of hidden financial power, the piece that few people see, but that silently influences the money history. Each crisis strengthened the ESF. When banks collapsed, it appeared behind the scenes. When currencies plummeted, it stabilized the exchange rate. When the dollar needed reinforcing its position. US dollar dominance, the fund acted as an invisible force. No one outside the inner circle understood how much these actions shaped the global financial system, explained, and precisely because it operated without depending on Congress, the ESF accumulated a type of power that other agencies could never have: speed, secrecy, and international reach. In practice, it was a shadow banking system state. Over time, the Treasury realized it could use this fund not only to avoid financial collapse, explained, but to influence markets, support allied countries, protect strategic banks, and intervene at crucial moments. And that is how the ESF stopped merely reacting to crises and began shaping entire scenarios, a transition that paves the way for something even more profound: the hidden mechanisms that keep the global financial system functioning even when the public is unaware that there is something to be explained. As the Exchange Stabilization Fund grew in reach and autonomy, it began operating in a space where few dared to enter, the territory of hidden financial mechanisms. This is the point where the story ceases to be merely political or economic and begins to resemble a carefully crafted plot. Within this shadow banking system, as a state-owned company, the ESF could move billions, influence foreign currencies, and even manipulate the international flow of capital without ever attracting attention. This is where the global financial system explained it gets confused with that which cannot be explained. It can only be understood between the lines. Much of its power came from its ability to operate in markets without revealing its intentions. For example, the ESF could buy strategic currencies to prevent speculation, intervene in liquidity crises to avoid financial collapse, explained, or even discreetly fund institutions that the government didn't want to publicly admit were at risk. All of this created the impression that certain economic recoveries happened naturally, when in reality they were the result of silent movements within this framework. Hidden financial power. This is the part of money history, something that rarely appears in books: what goes on behind the curtain. And it is precisely in this invisible layer that the ESF becomes a key element in maintaining dollar dominance. By controlling specific market moments, it prevents confidence in the dollar from fluctuating too much. When necessary, it can act in conjunction with large banks, brokerage firms, and even allied governments, but always maintaining institutional anonymity. This is how the fund transforms itself into a kind of silent conductor, leading the melody of the markets while everyone believes they are only hearing the music of supply and demand. This type of orchestrated intervention is what shapes how the US controls the world economy. What's most striking is realizing that these mechanisms aren't the exception, they're routine. And the more they repeat themselves, the more we realize we're facing a structure that functions as the invisible axis of empire finance history. This is a central theme that can only be understood by investigating real cases in which the ESF altered the destiny of entire countries without ever officially appearing. And it is precisely this territory that we will explore now. When the Exchange Stabilization Fund reached operational maturity, it gained access to a type of power that few government bodies in the world possess, the ability to intervene directly in the markets. And we're not just talking about technical adjustments. We're talking about actions that can redefine the value of currencies, prevent bank runs, and even alter the international perception of risk. It is at this point that the ESF ceases to be merely a stabilizer and begins to operate as the secret core of U.S. economic influence, the true secret government fund that acts where the headlines don't reach. One of the ESF's most impressive powers is its ability to manipulate the exchange rate without announcing any moves. It can buy or sell dollars, intervene in foreign currencies, coordinate actions with the Federal Reserve, or act alone, all to protect the US dollar dominance in international crises. He can lend money directly to foreign banks to prevent collapses, act as an end buyer of risky assets, and even bail out American institutions without leaving a public trace. This is the kind of action that any financial history documentary I would highlight as central, but it is almost never mentioned in traditional news reports. The critical point is that the ESF doesn't just respond to crises, it shapes market behavior. Knowing that the Treasury can act quietly to prevent sharp declines, large investors adjust their decisions. It's as if the ESF were an invisible player sitting at the table of the global market, always ready to influence the next move. This creates an illusion of stability that masks the true risks of the system. And it is precisely in this gray area, where politics, market, and secrecy overlap, that we understand the next step in the story: how the ESF operates behind the scenes of the biggest crises in the modern world. In times of crisis, when everything seems to crumble before the public eye, there is always a level of action that remains hidden. And it is precisely there that the Exchange Stabilization Fund operates most intensely. During various episodes in history, from currency collapses in Latin America to silent banking crises in Europe, the ESF has acted behind the scenes to prevent local problems from turning into global disasters. These movements are rarely documented, but experts investigating financial scandals, they know that whenever a crisis mysteriously calms down, there's a good chance that this fund has intervened. One of the central roles of the ESF in crises is to provide liquidity when no one else can or wants to do so. It can send billions to foreign banks, stabilize currencies that are in freefall, or even finance bailout operations that never make the headlines. These actions are part of what many analysts call financial collapse explained, because they reveal that economic recovery is not always an organic process. Often, it is a silent construction led by this hidden financial power. At the same time, the fund protects the dollar and reinforces the idea that the US is the central axis of the global economy. What's most fascinating is that the Family Health Strategy, ESF, doesn't seek recognition. Its role is exactly the opposite: to operate so discreetly that the population never realizes it was on the brink of disaster. And this silence creates something dangerous and powerful. Because if the public doesn't see the full crisis, they also don't see the real cost of the interventions. It's this game of shadows that sets the stage for the next point in the story: how the ESF became one of the most strategic tools for keeping the dollar at the top and shaping how the world understands economic power. At first glance, it may seem like a coincidence that the dollar has become the most powerful currency on the planet. But when we analyze what goes on behind the scenes, what really sustains it, will see US dollar dominance, we realize that none of this happened by accident. The Exchange Stabilization Fund plays a silent, yet decisive, role in preserving this supremacy. It acts as an invisible safety net, ensuring that the dollar never falls enough to lose prestige, and never rises in a way that harms international trade. It's a precise dance, performed away from the public eye, but essential for how the US controls the world economy. The ESF's strength lies in its ability to intervene at key moments. When a rival currency threatens to gain ground, the fund can intervene. When an allied country faces instability that could affect the dollar, it emerges with emergency liquidity. When international banks falter, it acts as a hidden stabilizer. These interventions shape the entire global financial system. Explained in a way, they create an environment where markets assume the dollar will always win, a self-fulfilling prophecy thanks to the silent work of this hidden financial power. But there is something even deeper in this influence. the more the dollar dominates the world, the more dependent countries become on it. And the more dependent they are, the greater the need for a fund to prevent any cracks in this system. Thus, the ESF transforms itself into a long-term strategic tool, consolidating its presence in almost every chapter of the empire finance history, and this invisible mechanism leads us to an inevitable point. What does all this mean for those trying to understand their money, their investments, and their financial security in a world that seems transparent, but isn't? When someone discovers the existence of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, the first reaction is usually surprise. But the second is much more powerful, a feeling that, for the first time, they are seeing what has always been there, hidden in plain sight. Understanding this fund, the $7.9 trillion company you've never heard of, is not just about history or curiosity. It's about realizing how the system really works, how the behind-the-scenes shaping of the economy is shaped, and how the secret power of the Treasury silently influences every crisis, every recovery, and every phase of money history. This knowledge changes everything because it shatters the illusion that the market is purely rational or completely free. It shows that there is a hidden financial power capable of adjusting movements, smoothing out falls, delaying collapses, and even reorganizing global flows to keep the dollar strong. For the average investor, this means two things: first, that markets are much more complex than they seem, and second, that a significant part of what we see in the news, appreciation, depreciation, stability, or chaos, is influenced by invisible mechanisms, such as the stock market hidden mechanisms, operated silently by the ESF. But perhaps the most transformative point is this: when you understand economic power explained in its rawest form, you realize that the global financial game isn't driven solely by companies, innovation, or competition. It's shaped by strategic decisions made in rooms where almost no one enters. And by recognizing this, you gain some rare clarity. A clarity that allows you to look at the market with less naivete and more strategy. And it's precisely this clarity that paves the way for the next part of our story, the conclusion that ties it all together and reveals why understanding this background changes not only how we see the world, but how we choose to live in it. Now that you know about the Exchange Stabilization Fund, this $7.9 trillion invisible company, it's impossible to look at the financial system the same way. Nothing happens by chance. There is a hidden power shaping the dollar, preventing collapses, and influencing markets while the world believes it is only seeing the logic of the economy. And that's the question that remains: if a silent fund can move currencies, banks, and countries, how does that affect your money? Understanding this mechanism puts you ahead of most people. It pulls you out of the illusion and puts you in reality, the reality of a system that operates in the shadows, but impacts every financial decision you make. Now it's your turn. Backhand index pointing right comment here: what surprised you most about this story? Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because in the next videos, we're going to reveal even more secrets behind the money that rules the world.